Okay.
So now it's your turn.
Okay.
So what are we going to talk about?
We're talking about classic children's literature and skeptical lessons in some familiar children's stories.
Ooh.
Yeah. I think what spawned this for me was a discussion that happened on the atheist list where someone wrote in and said that they had took their kid to see Horton Hears a Who.
Mm-hmm.
And that spawned a big discussion on what was the point to the movie? What does the movie say about, different things? And there was a question about whether the movie was an endorsement of faith or whether it was an endorsement of reason, and generally Dr. Seuss and what do some of those stories have to say about, most of the stories I think we agreed were practical lessons, practical life lessons. And with Horton, I have to admit the overall message of the story is summed up in that, even the smallest person can make a difference. That, you have the little who at the end, and, he pretty much makes all the difference for life and death for the entire Who world.
Oh, but that's not true. We're all just cogs in this wheel run by the Illuminati and the global banking scheme, and nothing you do makes
we can actually start with that one since I'm bringing it up. Most people, I think, are familiar with the plot, but just to summarize it, Horton is an elephant in sort of a fairy tale jungle, and he hears a speck of dust speaking to him. He has enormous elephant ears, and so he perceives this sound where none of the other creatures are able to hear it. And the speck of dust is actually a little planet. It's inhabited by little microscopic people called Whos, and they, according to the plot summary I found on the web, it said they asked him to protect them from harm, and I don't remember if that was the case or not. I actually just remember Horton is talking to the little Whos, and he gets overheard talking to the Whos, and then his friends think he's crazy. And to sort of cure Horton, they want to destroy the dust speck and just sort of get this over with, like, rip that security blanket away or whatever you want to call it, just get Horton away from his delusional dust speck, and maybe Horton will be okay at that point. And it's sort of cruel the way they go about it. It's not exactly understanding, or they don't try to be nice about it, and they're very judgmental. But at the end, what happens is Horton makes it clear to the little Who that he's talking to, who can also hear Horton, that if you don't make enough noise that other normal people's ears can hear you, they are going to kill you. Now, at this point, I think the Whos do take it on faith that somebody out there is going to do harm to us. They're getting word from this external source. They really don't know if Horton is reliable, but we need to make noise or someone's going to do harm to us. And okay, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but they take it seriously and they decide to make noise. Well, at that point, they all scream very loudly, and then they finally get the little last guy to scream very loudly, and it busts through the little dusty atmosphere, and everyone hears the chant, "We are here." And at that point, everyone recognizes that they're incorrect, that there is something going on in this little dust speck, that there are communicating little beings on there, and they don't boil the dust speck. So from a standpoint of a parent who's looking for, is this a skeptical lesson, or is this something that would promote religion to my child? Like, how should I take this? How should my child take this? What do I perceive it as? And my take on it was that I felt like it was a skeptical lesson because I felt like it didn't just say Horton believes this for no reason. First of all, Horton heard this, so he personally had some reason to believe it. He knows that he has very sensitive ears, and he's hearing a sound. And so in the case of Horton, it would make sense that he might hear something that someone else might not hear. He knows he has sensitive hearing, he has gigantic ears. So Horton trusts his perception because up to that point, I think, should assume that Horton's hearing has been fairly normal and he hasn't experienced a lot of abnormalities in his hearing. Sure. So he trusts his hearing, but no one else can hear it. And what that does is it creates a situation where the perception of the manifestation of the Whos is not available to anybody but Horton. So the problem then becomes, why should anyone believe Horton? And the response is, no one's going to believe him. They have no reason to believe him. And as soon as they're presented with an actual reason to believe him, they do. So the rest of the group, although they were somewhat cruel to Horton, actually behaved rationally. They felt that that Horton was suffering from a delusion because he's running around making claims about things being there that no one else can perceive. And then at the end of it, once they have an actual reason to accept the perception, or they get a perception and have a reason to accept the manifestation, they do, which is reasonable. And it, to me, is a little example of why sometimes it is important to substantiate what you believe if it's important to you that other people accept it. So if I have a belief personally, it may or may not matter whether I personally can substantiate it. The only significance to that would be what you say frequently, which is it only matters if it matters to me whether or not what I believe is most likely to be true.
Right.
If I care about that, then yes, I should want some reason to believe it. If I don't care about it, then it really doesn't matter whether I can substantiate what I believe or not until we reach a point where I feel like someone should believe me. If I want someone to believe me, or if I feel someone should believe me, or if I feel like someone should accept what I believe to be true, then I very much need to illustrate that there is some justification for my belief. That's when that becomes important. And that would be the opposite pretty much of faith. So
yeah, it reminds me a little bit. I mean, in the Ray Comfort Way of the Master series, I think it's episode 1 that's called The Firefighter, where he basically builds up this analogy to, it's as Christians, they have a duty to inform people that their souls are in jeopardy and they're going to hell. And he likens this to a firefighter who's going to come banging on your door and wake you up to get you out of the house because the house is on fire. The problem with his analogy, I mean, and then we can do this directly with Horton, is the firefighters, they're saying there's a fire, and yet I look all around my house and I don't see any evidence of a fire. As a matter of fact, right now all I see is some lunatic who woke me up out of a good sleep. So until there's actual evidence of a fire, there's no reason for me to justify or for me to believe what that other person believes. And if they believe it, and yet what they're really doing is saying, I know that you can't see this, but trust me, it's real. And there's no way for us as third-party individuals to distinguish between are they delusional
right.
or can they perceive something that we can't perceive. And in the only rational position is to reserve to wait until you have evidence before you accept the claim.
Right. Yeah, it's not, and it's not really akin to a situation where, for example, let's say I need contacts and you can see clearly, then I might trust your perception over mine.
Right.
But assuming all things are equal and without giving you some sort of special perceptual ability, I have no reason to think that something that's not manifesting to me would be manifesting to you,
right.
given all things being equal and that we're both normal, functioning, physically and mentally human beings.
Yeah, somebody at the last Beyond Belief conference said something along the lines of, reality is that which you and I agree on. I don't know that I necessarily go that far. Ooh, there's a little white mark. I don't know that I necessarily go that far in using that definition, but it certainly brings up a very big point, one that Tracie's brought up a lot about whether or not something manifests, and one that we continually bring up on the show, which is, if an individual has some kind of special knowledge or understanding of something, like people who claim that God has talked to them or they've felt God's presence, and that's the reason that they believe. I'll say it again, that's good enough for you as long as you don't require greater evidence. If God spoke to me and I was certain that this was a voice, I don't even know how you link a voice that you hear to this God concept in the first place. But if there was some incontrovertible way for me to create that linkage, I would then be justified in believing that a God exists. But that doesn't help me convince anybody else, and it doesn't make it real for anybody else. It becomes a very personal thing, which is indistinguishable from delusion to any outside observer.
Right, and I think that's like sort of the main thing is, is there a difference between a delusion and something that I believe that no one else can justify, and that kind of comes to another little story, which is The Emperor's New Clothes, which I think is probably the clearest. It was the clearest example I could come up with of a classical story with a skeptical message, because to me it was just purely about skepticism. The rest of the stories actually have kind of sidelines that align with skepticism, but Emperor's New Clothes is just flat out skepticism. And just for that story, there's a prideful emperor, and he's very into all the things that he surrounds him with, all the trappings that make him better than everyone else in a very visible way. And he gets swindled by two men who claim to be the greatest tailors in the world, and they tell him that they have come up with a new way of making cloth, and it's the finest cloth that can be made. And the interesting thing about this cloth is that only if you're highly perceptive and very intelligent can you perceive it. To everyone else, especially to the foolish, they can't even visually perceive the clothing. So the emperor is taken in by his pride, and he wants to be perceived as bright and intelligent and wise, and so he claims to be able to see the clothing, and he goes along with the act and talks about how wonderful the clothes are and how great the clothes are, and it just doesn't really come to any harm until the very end of the story, when he decides to wear this fine suit of clothes in a public procession where he proceeds down the street completely naked. And at that point, a lot of people in the town are afraid to say anything because he's the emperor, and so they all either have to just keep their mouths shut or feign that they also think it's a wonderful suit of fantastic clothing, until a child steps up and says, "Hey, the emperor's naked." And at that point, you know, everybody understands that the emperor is naked. It's okay to say that. And the synopsis that I found online says that the emperor continued to believe that he was wearing clothes. I honestly don't recall that from the story, but whether he did or not is kind of here nor there. The point is, he was walking down the street nude, and nobody wanted to call him on it for different reasons. The emperor wanted to believe he had the great clothes on because he wanted to consider himself to be brilliant. And all of the people that went along with this game wanted to either stay out of trouble or they wanted to be supportive of the emperor. So what to me that is it's a lesson in pride for sure, that if you're extremely prideful and people understand that, you can be taken advantage of because people can drag you around by that sense of pride. But to me, the skeptical lesson is that when somebody presents you with something that should be obvious, like obvious to a child, and they're telling you it's not what it appears to be, it's a little ridiculous to just accept that without asking for some sort of support for that claim.
Right.
I know what clothing is. I know what clothing looks like. You can perceive cloth. There's no reason you shouldn't be able to perceive it. So if someone tells me that they've got invisible clothing, I need to have some reason to believe that. I shouldn't just be accepting someone at their word. And the emperor, being driven by pride and the motivations that drive the other people, shows that there are many reasons, and it's not just this story, but in life, there are many reasons why a person would want to believe a thing that is not true. A person might, for example, get clues that their spouse is cheating, and they don't want to believe that. They want to believe their spouse is faithful. So they may disregard that they found a hotel receipt, and they may think to themselves, well, maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just a piece of paper that he grabbed on accident. Or, you can come up with all kinds of excuses to ignore what's right in front of your face when you have a reason to ignore it, when you have a reason to believe something that's untrue and toss out what is obviously true. You will tend to go for your emotional reasons very often. They can stop you significantly from evaluating a situation in a reasonable fashion and actually getting at what's happening.
Yeah. There's a, and I don't have it here, but there was a good kind of parody of this that P.Z. Myers did after Richard Dawkins had been accused of not addressing real religion. And so he spun it as this, Emperor's New Clothes thing, which was brilliant, and both Richard and P.Z. have used it, or Richard's used it a number of times in his lecture, which, I enjoyed. But the idea here is they're attempting to dupe somebody, and they're making an appeal to emotion, essentially, of pride or self-importance or whatever else. And because the emperor doesn't want to be perceived as inferior, he goes along with it. And he even, on some level, he must realize that he's pretending to see these clothes.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it may reach the level of delusion where he's convinced himself that he can actually see the clothes, which, now we've entered another level where rubber rooms are probably, a good recommendation. But we see the same thing in many different religions. And when people are in a particular religion and they begin to question, is this real? Or, how do I know when I've heard the voice of God? Or how do I know how God's leading? And they're often given things that amount to this same kind of emperor's new clothing appeal to emotion. It's, we are weak and feeble creations who cannot possibly understand the mind of God. So you must simply have faith. And as long as you keep trudging along and your faith is good enough, you'll get more in tune with what God wants. So it gets somebody to the point where they're going to go through the motions even when they're doubting, in the hope that they'll eventually get this connection and be able to, hear the voice of God or whatever. But what it also does is that gets them accustomed to going through the motions regardless, and it becomes this self-reinforcing delusion where it becomes more real to them, because the second that it becomes unreal, they have to face the fact that they have wasted tons and tons of time and energy and perhaps money believing something that they have no reason to believe. And as somebody who went through that particular scenario, I can empathize. It's frustrating, incredibly frustrating, to realize that you've spent a good chunk of your life believing something with no good reason at all. You bought into a fallacy. You bought into an emotional appeal. You let your insecurities, which I think is one of the things with the emperor. He's prideful, but he's also extremely insecure. He's afraid that he is too stupid too less than to see the clothes, etc. And we end up, we are emotional creatures who want to connect. And we don't want to feel inferior. We don't want to recognize that in some cases we've made mistakes, we've made decisions for bad reasons, or we've just been stupid. And it hurts, especially when you find out how much time you've wasted on something like this. So it kind of, there's this encouragement to stay in it and keep going, right. Which is why in the summary, even despite the people laughing at him, the emperor keeps walking down the road. And the religions have this, especially Christianity, built right into them, where they say right from the get-go, these other people, they're going to scoff at you. They're going to laugh at you. They're going to try to tell you that you have no good reason to believe this. They're going to do everything they can to destroy your world. These are just God haters. No, we're not. We're realists. We're rationalists. We're people who say, okay, if you believe something, give me the evidence for it. Show me why this should be. Demonstrate to me that your emperor is not naked. That's I think that's the position that we're in, right. And that there are some people, who stick with their religions and just say, oh, you don't get it.
Well, in fact, the response is very similar to the emperor's response. I mean, he doesn't respond in the story, but for example, his implied response is, you are simply not intelligent enough to right. perceive this. And when you talk to a lot of theists and you tell them, I really need to know, how do you know this? Or what makes you believe this? The response is very often, well, you just have to be open to this.
Right.
You have to be, make yourself available to this. You have to be willing to believe. I've even had people tell me that if I would read the Bible, and I'm going to say and or the Quran, because I've had somebody tell me that too, if you would just read these books, you will believe them, you will see. And I was like, okay, I'll read it. And immediately I get an email back, in both cases, that says, but you have to be willing to believe it when you read it.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, wait a second. The reason I'm reading it is because I don't believe it. I mean, you told me that reading it would make me a believer, so I can't believe it before I read it. You already know I don't believe it, so what you're telling me is that if I don't believe it before I read it, it won't work.
Yeah.
So the whole question was, how do you know this and how do you believe this, and what is convincing? And you're telling me what would convince me is reading the book, but I have to believe it before I read it, which that doesn't even make sense. I mean, I don't even know how to respond to that. You
got to believe in order to believe.
Yeah, you have to be willing to believe it before you read it. And it's just like, well, I mean, I'm open to examining it,
Right.
and if it justifies belief, it's not like I'm going to sit there and look at something that's completely convincing and say, oh, I'm not willing to even consider it, even though I've got convincing evidence in front of me.
Yeah.
But as somebody who has read the Bible and who tried to get through the Quran, it's just when I got to parts that were, I felt kind of, I guess, offended my personal sense of morality. At that point, I just was like, well, I would have trouble with this even if it was true. So I, it wouldn't do me any good to continue reading.
Well, there's a number of these religions that promote the idea that the individuals who are in the in-group are in fact special. Not just that we're all the special creation, but that you are the special chosen few. The Jews were the chosen of God. The Christians are the new chosen who get to go on up to heaven and whatever. On the night of the pub crawl, walking downtown, I ran across a couple of evangelists and spoke to them for a while. And one of them, in the trying to get him to offer any evidence to support his position, said, "Well, I've performed miracles." I'm not making this up. And so I asked what miracles he'd performed, and I probably talked about it on the show before, so I'll keep this short. Basically, the weatherman had said that it was going to rain, and he had something important to do, so he went and prayed that it wouldn't rain, and it didn't rain. And he did this 3 times in a row, so it must be a miracle. And I said, well, if your goal is to come out here and convince me that this is true and to save my soul, which I don't have any reason to believe that exists either, then why don't you perform a miracle for me? And without missing a beat, the defense mechanism pops up and says, well, you're not worth it. Whoa, I'm not worth it?
Why are you
I thought you were
talking to
out
me?
here trying to save souls. Doesn't your God love me too? Doesn't he want to save me? Why is it that you're so special that God will stop the rain for you 3 times in a row, but you can't even show me, like a super card trick or something to try and you're just not worthy. Okay. And I realize that, this is a defense mechanism. He realizes he's talking to somebody who's only going to accept real evidence and not appeals to emotion and not appeals to flattery, where don't you want to be one of the special ones with us? And so he knows he can't perform, so he comes up with an excuse as to why not. And we hear the same excuses over and over again. I mean, in these, going back to Ray Comfort, he'll flat out say, I can prove to you that God exists in, a minute or 10 seconds or 30 seconds or whatever crazy number he's picking out now. And he'll flat out claim that if you want concrete evidence that God exists, it's really easy. You just hit your knees and you openly say, hey, God, I'm here. I want you to demonstrate and prove yourself to me. And he will reveal himself to you. This is a promise that's in the Bible, and therefore it must be true. And yeah, that doesn't explain why it hasn't worked for me or any number of other people. Well, what excuse is there? I mean, what reason do you have why this hasn't worked? This is all, the emperor is still naked. Your Bible is naked. Your God is naked. Your miracles are naked. It's insane.
Right.
And there's never any real offer of proof or evidence. And you argue and you talk and get down to a certain point. And then without fail, it becomes you must just accept this on faith, which is what you were talking about. You have to read the Bible by starting to believe it first, and then you'll see how true it is. Oh, clever that.
Yeah, and I've had theists actually tell me that, there's all this evidence and it's the same evidence for everyone, and, anyone can see that this is enough evidence to believe. And I look at it, and when I talk to them about my problems with it, which inevitably there ends up being, what they'll say is, well, it's enough to convince me, and, if you don't accept it, and I'm like, well, I told you what I require as evidence, which is no more or less than the evidence of existence for anything else that we know exists. So when it gets to that point, my response is very similar to what you just said, which is, isn't it interesting that you don't require faith, that God has given you this abundance of evidence that just completely convinces you, and yet when I say I would like evidence that convinces me, you say, well, it's wrong to ask for that.
Yeah.
Well, why is it wrong for me to ask for something that would convince me, and yet you get this ton of evidence that is convincing to you?
Well, the other thing is when they come back with that, it was enough evidence to convince me thing, I tend to pry a little deeper because, quite honestly, I don't believe that that's true. If it was enough, if the evidence that they often give, which is non-evidence, excuse me, if it's enough to convince them, then similar evidence of other claims should also be enough to convince them. And what you discover is that they don't have consistent evidentiary standards at all.
That's correct.
They've made a special case exemption for this one, where this evidence is enough for me to believe this, but if it was for any other claim, it wouldn't be enough.
In fact, if it was for any other God, it wouldn't be enough.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah. Let's, I'm gonna feel free to dismiss all those other religions, even though their evidence is just as good as what convinced me that mine's true.
I've had parallel arguments with a Muslim and Christians. Parallel, for them telling me exactly why I should believe in their God, and it's down the line. And I look at that, and it's just like you're saying, then why doesn't the Christian also accept the Quran? Oh, who's a tall?
I was just getting ready to hit the button. We had Brandon on the line was going to ask something. So if you want to call back, we'll jump in.
The lines are clear, so it's a great
So yeah, the lines are clear. The phone number, we can put the phone number back up. As a reminder, after the program's over, we'll be going to El Arroyo on 5th Street. We're going to keep going with some of these stories, but if you've got stories or observations of your own, or if you disagree, about what standards of evidence should be used, or tell us what you believe and why you believe it, or why also should anybody else believe it.
Right. Well, that was, I think, the letter you were referring to, just like at the beginning of the show. It was this, that was long, that email that we got. Oh my gosh, that thing was just, every time I thought I was getting toward the end, I'd click and there's a whole other page, big long paragraphs, just paragraph after paragraph after. I was just like, wow, this person wrote a lot.
She was like, wow, did Matt write this?
No, it was beyond what I would write. It was crazy. And so I end up reading this thing, and it's just this huge explanation from a theist of here's what I believe. And at the end, they said, what are your thoughts? I'd like to know your thoughts. Yeah. And I thought, I'd like to know why you believe this. Frankly, I don't really care about any of the stuff you spent time writing. Like, it's insane to me that you would write this huge amount explaining in great detail everything you believe, but not put in one sentence to explain why it's justified or why you believe what you believe. Because to me, if there's no reason for you to believe it, why do I care what you believe? And I didn't mean it, it's like I told him, I said, I'm not saying that to sound cruel, but seriously, if someone's going on and on to you about their belief and you're sitting there thinking, why would someone believe this? It doesn't really matter what they believe. It just is going on and on about something you think is unjustified. Okay, and that, when you were talking about the rain miracle, that was kind of interesting because one of the stories that I had down is Stone Soup, which is about causation. And so I want to just real quickly, before I get into it, when you were talking about making it stop raining, I always joke at home about how I think the weatherman should be forced to wear a turban with a jewel and have a crystal ball, like when they give the forecast. I go, it's funny that they even call it a forecast,
Yeah.
And they're so often wrong that it seems like, they should just be up there with tarot cards or something. I understand there's meteorology, but I don't know.
Well, we do have a pretty good understanding of how weather systems on the planet work.
But it's so unpredictable.
Well, what it is we're dealing with probabilities.
Right.
And without getting off on a tangent, if there's a blog, Good Math, Bad Math, that touched a little bit on the different types of probabilistic analysis. The weatherman, and when this guy told me that God stopped the rain for him 3 times, I asked him, I was like, so wait, are you saying that the weatherman's always right?
Exactly.
No.
Yeah, that's
No,
my
I'm
point.
not saying that. So, all right, I'll let you put a number on it. What percentage do you think that the weatherman's always right? He's like, 80%. 80% right. Great. So 20% of the time he's wrong, and yet he was wrong 3 times, and you think that God intervened on your behalf to stop the rain. I just, I want to make sure.
Right.
What are the probabilities that God's intervening? Now we can actually do the math.
Well, the other thing it made me think of was, I don't know if you've ever read Mark Twain, but there's a story called A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court.
Right.
And in that tale, the guy goes back in time and he's in King Arthur's court and he ends up getting to be in a position of authority in the court. And there's a guy that's like a thorn in his side that's vying for power, which was Merlin. And so Merlin is sort of this charlatan wizard in the story, and he does these little hocus pocus tricks, and everyone's amazed. But of course, the more modern man who's gone back in time sees that these tricks are simply tricks. So he wants to discredit this wizard in front of these people. And so what he does is, when he becomes like an advisor to the king, he makes Merlin in charge of the weather forecast. So it becomes Merlin's job to predict the weather. And of course, Merlin fails so miserably that he's completely discredited, and by the end of the story, everyone thinks he's just a joke. So, I mean, the idea that someone would use a weather event that didn't align with the forecast as a miracle, that's one of those, there's miracles, and then there's miracles.
Yeah.
And this is one of those miracles.
I found my keys. It's a miracle.
Exactly. And so anyway, that was just funny. And to me, that is about causation, because there are times when it doesn't rain and it looks like it's going to rain all day, or times when rain is predicted and it never rains.
Well, when we went to church, it was cloudy and it looked like it was going to thunderstorm, and they were already up there that morning thanking God for the rain that he was getting ready to deliver. And I don't know if it rained on top of their church or not, but I think there were about a minute of sprinkles down here by the studio, and then it just stayed cloudy, and it rained the next day. So maybe they were thinking got a whole day in advance.
Right.
But
We got a call. We should take that, and then we'll get back to
yeah, we
causation.
better take calls before